There is something your grandmother never told you. Not because she was hiding it, but because some things are too heavy to hand a child. Some things you carry for a while before you pass them on. And by the time she was ready, by the time the words were almost there, the world moved on, and the moment passed, and what she knew went with her when she went. But it didn't start with your grandmother. It started long before her, long before anyone living can remember. It started in the dark. I am talking about a time when black people in this country were not allowed to feed themselves, when the body that did the labor was not trusted to choose what went into it, when the kitchen was the slaveholder's kitchen, and the cookhouse was the slaveholder's cookhouse, and everything grown in the ground and pulled from the river and raised in the yard belonged, by law, by violence, by the logic of a system built on theft, to someone else. And yet, they ate. They fed each other. They planted things in corners where nobody looked. They cooked by firelight after the work was done and the overseer had gone to sleep. They passed a recipe not on paper. They couldn't, but in the hands of a daughter watching her mother work, in the shape of a gesture, in a phrase said low enough that only the right ears would catch it. This was not just cooking. This was survival. This was resistance. This was a people saying, in the only language the system could not completely silence, "We are still here, and we still know who we are." Today, I am going to take you back to that time, to the fields, the quarters, the cookhouses, the riverbanks, and the hidden gardens where our ancestors grew and cooked and preserved 25 foods that history never wrote down. Foods that kept bodies alive when the system was designed to break them. Foods that carried memory across generations that were not supposed to have memory at all. These are not recipes for a Sunday dinner party. This is a testimony, and it deserves to be heard. Hey family, I'm James, and today we are going somewhere we don't talk about enough, not as pain, but as power. We are going to the origins of Black American foodways, the real origins, the ones that predate the cookbooks, predate the restaurants, predate everything we call soul food today. Before we go there, if you are new to this channel, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what we do here, every single week, is make sure none of this gets forgotten again. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let's go back to the beginning. Number 1, pot liquor. Now before anything else, understand this. Pot liquor is not a mistake. It is not the water you pour down the drain when the greens are done. Among enslaved people on the plantations of the antebellum South, pot liquor was medicine. It was sustenance. It was sometimes the only nourishment a person received in a full day. When the slaveholding household ate the meat and the vegetables, what was left behind in the pot, the liquid that had simmered for hours with collard greens or turnip greens or mustard greens, would often be passed to the enslaved quarters. Some slaveholders did this as a deliberate act of the barest minimum. Give them the water, keep the food. What they did not understand, what they could not understand, was that the pot liquor was, in many ways, the most nutritious thing in the pot. The vitamins from the greens had leached into that liquid. The minerals were there. The folate, the iron, the calcium. Every long-simmered hour had made that broth richer, not poorer. And so our ancestors drank it. They soaked their cornbread in it. They gave it to children and to elders and to the sick. They did not call it deprivation. They called it wisdom. And when emancipation came, and when freedom was imperfectly, violently, incompletely achieved, they did not stop making pot liquor. They brought it forward. They passed it to their grandchildren. Today we call it a side dish. Back in those days, it was life itself. Number 2, poke salad. Child, let me tell you something about this plant. Pokeweed, Phytolacca americana, grows wild across the American South. It grows in thickets and fence lines and the edges of cleared land. It has deep purple berries that look inviting and will kill you if you eat them raw. It has leaves that, if you don't know what you are doing, will make you wish you hadn't. But if you know what you are doing, and our ancestors knew, Pokeweed leaves, properly prepared, become something else entirely. The leaves must be parboiled. The first water must be poured off, because that water carries the toxins. Then you boil them again, sometimes a third time. And what you end up with is a tender green that has a flavor unlike anything you've tasted. Dark, mineral, earthy in a way that collard greens never quite reach. Enslaved people gathered pokeweed because it grew where nobody planted it. It asked nothing of the soil that didn't belong to them. It could be gathered in the early spring when the stores were thin and the gardens hadn't yet come in. The knowledge of how to prepare it, which parts to use, how many times to change the water when it was safe, was survival knowledge passed from hand to hand, from elder to child, in the quarters where the slaveholder rarely ventured. You won't see that today. Most people alive have never tasted poke salad. But there are still old folks in the rural South who know it, and every one of them learned it from someone who learned it from someone who was not allowed to be wrong about what was safe to eat. Number 3. Ash cake. In the quarters, there was no oven. There was a fireplace sometimes. There was a cook fire outside. What there was not was equipment. What there was not was permission to use the main house kitchen for anything other than the labor of feeding the slaveholder's family. And so when cornmeal was available, when it had been given or gleaned or carefully saved, the women in the quarters made ash cake. They mixed the cornmeal with water and a little salt when salt could be had. They shaped it flat. And then they buried it directly in the hot ashes at the edge of the fire. No pan, no skillet. Just dough and fire and patience and knowledge. What came out was a bread with a slightly smoky crust, ash dusted on the outside, cooked through on the inside. It was not a beautiful thing by any measure. It was not the light, golden cornbread that would come later, when cast-iron skillets became part of black kitchens, and there was lard enough to grease them. This was older than that. This was the bread that existed before the bread we know. Some historians call it the oldest form of cornbread in the black American tradition. I believe them, because it required nothing that could be taken away. Just fire and grain and the knowledge of how to bring them together in the dark. Number 4. Cracklin' cornbread. Now this one required a little more, but only a little. When a hog was slaughtered on a plantation, the enslaved people who did the butchering, who did all the butchering, let us be clear, were often permitted to keep the parts that the slave-holding household did not want. The entrails, the feet, the ears, the head, the skin. The skin, when rendered, when the fat is cooked out of it over low heat, produces two things, lard and cracklins. Cracklins are the crispy remnants of pork skin after the fat has been extracted. And in the quarters, when those cracklins were available, they went into the cornbread. This was not luxury. This was necessity transformed into something extraordinary. The cracklins gave the cornbread texture and fat and a depth of flavor that you could not replicate any other way. The lard that came off that rendering greased the skillet if you had one, or was saved for other cooking. Nothing was wasted. The concept of waste was a luxury no one in the quarters could afford. Cracklin' cornbread survived. You can still find it today at certain old barbecue places, at church suppers in the rural South, at the tables of grandmothers who learned from grandmothers who learned from women who cooked this bread by firelight in a world that had given them nothing and from which they had made everything. Number 5. Sowbully. Salt pork, the cured belly of the pig, heavy with fat, often more fat than meat, was a staple ration given to enslaved people across the South. It was given precisely because it was cheap, because the slaveholder had taken the good cuts, the ham, the chops, the shoulder roasts. Sowbelly was what remained. But here is what happened with sowbelly. Our ancestors cooked it with greens, and the fat rendered into the pot, and the greens absorbed that fat, and what resulted was something that had no business being as good as it was. Slow-cooked collards with sowbelly, turnip greens with sowbelly, field peas with sowbelly. The pork's salt seasoned everything. The fat made the beans rich, and the greens silky. Now, before we go any further, family, I want to hear from you. What I am talking about today, these forgotten foods, these secret traditions, they did not disappear entirely. Some of them made it to your grandmother's table. Some of them maybe made it to yours. Drop a comment down below. Tell me, what is one food your grandmother or great-grandmother cooked that nobody in the younger generation makes anymore? Tell me the name of that dish. Tell me where your family was from. I read every single one, and I guarantee somebody watching right now has got a story about the same thing. Let's keep this alive together, family. Number 6. Chitterlings. Let me say this plainly, because it deserves to be said plainly. Chitterlings are not a punchline. I know that in certain circles, the mention of chitterlings is treated as a joke. I know that the smell of their cleaning and their cooking is considered, by people who don't understand their history, to be something undesirable. I want you to understand what they actually are. When a hog was killed on a plantation, every edible part of that animal was parceled out according to a hierarchy of value. At the top of that hierarchy sat the slaveholding family, who took the cuts of meat that were worth money, that were flavorful without labor, that were easy to prepare. At the bottom of that hierarchy sat the enslaved people, who received what was left. The intestines, the chitterlings, were by the reckoning of that hierarchy worthless. They were wrong. Our ancestors cleaned those intestines with extraordinary care and labor. They cooked them long and slow with onion and pepper and vinegar until they were tender. They made a dish from the thing that had been thrown at them as an insult, and they turned it into a tradition that survives to this day. There are families who cook chitterlings every New Year's Eve, every Christmas, who would no sooner skip that dish than they would skip seeing their mother. That is what resistance looks like in a kitchen. You take the thing they discarded, you put your hands and your time and your knowledge into it, and you make something worth passing down. Number 7. Hopping John. Black-eyed peas and rice, cooked together. A dish so old, so layered with meaning, that tracing its exact origin becomes an act of archaeology across continents. Because black-eyed peas, Vigna unguiculata, are not native to North America. They came from West Africa. They came, along with so much else, in the holds of slave ships, carried as provisions or mixed in with cargo, or saved by someone who knew that the seed was worth more than anything the slaveholder could give them. In the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, where large numbers of enslaved people came from rice-growing regions of West Africa and brought with them knowledge of rice cultivation that transformed the colony's economy, Hopping John became a fixture. It was food that reminded people of somewhere else, somewhere before, of a world that existed prior to the one they had been forced into. Some people will tell you Hopping John is good luck food, eaten on New Year's Day. And it is. But the luck it carries is older than any superstition. It is the luck of survival, the luck of a seed that crossed the Atlantic and kept growing on hostile soil. Every pot of Hopping John is a resurrection. Number 8. Roasted sweet potato. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, was perhaps the single most important food in the diet of enslaved people in the American South. This is not an exaggeration. It grew in poor soil. It produced abundantly. It stored well through the winter. It required no dairy, no lard, no seasoning to be good. You could eat it plain from the fire and be fed. Its natural sweetness made it palatable to children. Its density made it satisfying to adults after a full day of brutal labor. Enslaved people were sometimes permitted to keep small garden plots, no more than a quarter acre, sometimes less, on which they could grow their own food, and sweet potatoes were frequently the anchor of those plots. They grew where other things might not. They produced where other things might fail. Roasted directly in the coals, whole, unpeeled, buried in the ashes the way ash cake was buried and left to cook slowly through, a sweet potato becomes something almost magical. The skin chars. The interior steams in its own moisture. The sugars caramelize. No butter needed. No sugar added. This is what food tastes like when the land still remembers who tended it. Number 9. Dried and smoked fish. In plantation country along rivers and coastal areas, the Georgia Sea Islands, the Mississippi Delta, the rivers of the Carolinas, enslaved people sometimes had access to water, and where there was water, there were fish, catfish, perch, bream. And when fishing was permitted, on Sundays, which in many places was the one day the fieldwork stopped, our ancestors fished. But a fish caught on Sunday cannot be eaten only on Sunday. It must keep. And so they learned, or rather, they had always known, because this knowledge comes from West Africa, where drying and smoking fish was ancient practice, how to preserve what they caught. Fish salted and laid in the sun. Fish hung over smoke for days until it had lost most of its moisture and could be stored. Fish that, when crumbled into a pot of greens or a pot of field peas weeks later, gave everything it seasoned a richness and a depth that fresh fish could not provide. This was economy. This was planning. This was the kind of intelligence that systems of enslavement tried to deny and that our ancestors demonstrated every single day simply by staying alive. Number 10. Field peas. Not the sweet garden peas you find in a frozen bag today. I am talking about field peas, crowder peas, lady peas, iron and clay peas, cow peas, the legumes that were planted in fields to restore nitrogen to depleted soil. Grown by the slaveholder's hand for the soil's benefit, not for the table. But our ancestors ate them. When the fields were being turned, when the dried peas were being stored, the women who did the threshing and sorting kept some back. Field peas cooked low and slow become something else entirely. They have an earthiness, a mealiness, a savory depth that the cultivated garden pea doesn't come close to. They absorb whatever they're cooked with, a scrap of pork, a dried pepper, an onion, and give it all back in the pot liquor. Field peas with pot liquor and cornbread was a full meal, not a side dish, a full meal. And it cost the slaveholder nothing. In fact, it was built from what the slaveholder had already written off as livestock feed or soil amendment. Our ancestors looked at what was available and found nourishment inside it. That is not desperation. That is genius. Number 11. Persimmon beer. Now we are moving into territory that surprises some people. Enslaved people made fermented beverages. This is documented. And one of the most widespread was persimmon beer, a drink made from the ripe fruit of the American persimmon tree, Diospyros virginiana, which grows wild throughout the South and was worth nothing to a slaveholder who wasn't looking at it. Ripe persimmons, and they must be ripe, the ones that have gone soft after the first frost, because an underripe persimmon will make your mouth go dry and pucker in a way you won't forget, were mashed and mixed with water and sometimes cornmeal or sweet potato and allowed to ferment. The result was a mildly alcoholic drink, not strong enough to be classified as spirits, but enough to warm the body and ease the evening. This was not debauchery. This was a reclamation of pleasure. In a world that was designed to extract labor and deny humanity, the act of sitting down with something you had made with your own hands, that had no master's name on it, that existed simply because you had looked at a tree and understood its gifts, that was freedom in miniature. That was a door, propped open just barely, into a life that was supposed to have been taken from you completely. Number 12. Groundnut soup. The peanut, called groundnut in West Africa, where it originates, came to North America aboard slave ships. It was brought not as a luxury, not as a commodity for the plantation economy, but as food for the enslaved. Portable, protein-dense, shelf-stable, it was the kind of food you pack for a terrible voyage. And when the voyage was over, if you survived it, you brought what you knew about it with you. Groundnut soup is an ancient West African dish. A thick, rich stew built on a base of peanuts pounded into a paste, combined with whatever was available, dried fish, greens, yam, peppers. It carried memory of a continent most of the people who made it would never see again. On the plantation, groundnut soup evolved into what it had to become, built with American sweet potato instead of African yam, with whatever scrap of meat could be obtained, with the peanuts that were now being grown commercially in the South, and that could sometimes be gleaned from the fields. The form changed. The soul did not. Every bowl of groundnut soup was an act of cultural preservation in a world that was actively trying to strip every point of origin away. Now, family, let me stop here for a moment and tell you something. What I'm describing today, these 25 foods, they are not just recipes. They are receipts. They are proof. Proof that something survived. The Soul Roots cookbook that I put together. It contains 100 of these forgotten Black American recipes, written out complete, the way Big Mama would have done it, with every ingredient, every step, every tip. The link is in the description and pinned right up top in the comments. Scan the code on your screen if you're watching on TV. These recipes were almost gone. Don't let them disappear again. Number 13. Wild greens, lamb's quarter, and wood sorrel. Beyond the pokeweed, beyond the cultivated greens that were sometimes available, enslaved people foraged a whole pharmacopoeia of wild plants that the slaveholder's household walked past without a second glance. Lamb's quarter, Chenopodium album, grows as a weed in disturbed soil and tastes, when cooked, like a more mineral, more complex version of spinach. Wood sorrel, oxalis, has a sharp, lemony bite that could brighten any pot. Dandelion greens, bitter and iron-rich. Purslane, succulent and slightly sour. This was not random. This was botanical knowledge brought from Africa and augmented with knowledge of North American plants acquired over generations. Knowing which wild plant was food and which was poison, which could be eaten raw, and which needed cooking, which needed to be dried, and which should only be eaten fresh. This was survival knowledge of the highest order. There were women in the quarters who were the keepers of this knowledge, who knew the land not as property, because they were property in the logic of that system, but as a provider, who could walk through the edge of a woods and see a meal where a slaveholder saw only undergrowth. That knowledge was passed down, quietly, persistently, against every force that tried to interrupt it. Number 14. Beaten biscuits. The beaten biscuit is one of the most labor-intensive preparations in the entire canon of Southern food. To make a beaten biscuit, you combine flour and fat and salt, no leavening, no baking powder, none of the chemical shortcuts that came later. And then you beat the dough. You beat it with a mallet or a rolling pin or a wooden bat for 30 minutes, sometimes longer. You beat it until the gluten develops in a particular way that makes the finished biscuit crack open with a clean snap instead of pulling apart. Enslaved women in plantation kitchens made beaten biscuits every single morning for the slaveholder's household breakfast table, every single morning, before sunup. Standing at a wooden table in a cookhouse that was separate from the main house because the risk of fire was considered more acceptable than the discomfort of being too close to the people doing the labor. They made the biscuits. They were not at the breakfast table. And yet the beaten biscuit survived as a tradition in Black Southern cooking, carried out of the plantation kitchens by the women who developed the technique, passed to daughters who made them for their own families, who made them on their own terms, the same hands, a different table. That is the whole arc of Black American food history in a single recipe. Number 15. Corn hominy, nixtamal. Hominy, dried corn kernels treated with an alkali solution, traditionally wood ash lye, is one of the most important food technologies in human history, and it arrived in the American South through two separate tributaries, from indigenous nations of North America, who had practiced nixtamalization for thousands of years, and from West African culinary traditions that had their own fermentation and alkaline processing knowledge. What the lye treatment does to corn is remarkable. It unlocks nutrients that are otherwise inaccessible. Corn that has not been nixtamalized can sustain life, but will eventually lead to pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease that devastated populations across the South in the 19th and early 20th centuries, who had begun eating processed cornmeal that had the germ removed and had not been nixtamalized. But communities that continued the old practice of making hominy from whole dried corn with wood ash, lye had no pellagra. They did not know the biochemistry. They knew the practice. They knew it worked. They passed it down not as science, that language wasn't available to them, but as method. This is how you do it. This is what it looks like. This is when you know it's right. And in the passing of that knowledge, they were passing protection. Literal nutritional protection, embedded in a food tradition that was dismissed as primitive by the very society that would suffer for abandoning it. Number 16. Muscadine wine. The muscadine grape, Vitis rotundifolia, grows wild across the American Southeast. It is a thick-skinned, intensely sweet grape with a musky aroma, unlike anything you'll find in a wine store. Slaveholders made wine from it for their own cellars. They also made money from it. And in the quarters, when muscadine grapes could be gathered, from the edges of cleared land, from fence lines, from the wild margins that the plantation left to grow, enslaved people made their own wine, simpler than the slaveholders. Made in whatever vessel could be repurposed. Fermented in the warmth of summer into something that was, by every reasonable definition, their own. The making of muscadine wine in the quarters was, on most plantations, technically prohibited, which means it happened quietly, which means the knowledge of how to make it was passed in whispers, not in declarations, which means the very fact that this knowledge survived is its own testimony to the stubbornness of joy, to the insistence of our ancestors on maintaining practices of pleasure and sociality, even when those practices could not be done openly. Now, family, if you've stayed with me this long, that tells me something about you. It tells me you're not here for easy history. You're here for the real thing. And I want you to think for a moment about someone in your family who is still carrying knowledge like this, old recipes, old methods, old traditions, in their head, not written anywhere. Someone who is getting older. The Soul Roots cookbook can't replace what they know. Nothing can replace that. But it can give you a place to start. 100 Forgotten Recipes. Complete. Preserved. Link in the description. Scan the code on screen. I didn't build this thing so it could sit unused. I built it because I watched too many recipes leave this world with the people who carried them. Don't let that happen to yours. Number 17. Souse. Head cheese. When a hog was killed, the head went to the quarters. The feet, the tail, the ears. The parts that required the most labor to prepare, the most skill to make edible, the most patience to cook correctly. And from those parts, the women in the quarters made souse. Souse is made by simmering the head, and the feet and ears, if available, in water with vinegar and spices for many hours, until the meat falls from the bone and the liquid, rich with collagen, is ready to gel. You pick the meat, you strain the liquid, you combine them and pour the whole thing into a form to set. When it is cold, it slices clean. It has a gelatinous texture that is not for everyone, but that is extraordinarily nutritious. The collagen, the minerals that cook out of the bones, the vinegar that preserves and adds brightness. This is nose-to-tail cooking, not as trend, not as the culinary philosophy of a restaurant, but as necessity elevated by skill. And the women who made souse were not celebrated for it, not in any newspaper, not in any cookbook of the era, not by anyone outside the community who would eat it. But their families ate well. And the knowledge of how to do this, how to turn a hog's head into something clean and nourishing and worth making, that is not a small thing. Number 18. Dried corn. Before the refrigerator, before the freezer, before the canning jar even, which did not become widely available until the middle of the 19th century. There was drying. And dried corn, field corn, cut from the cob at the right stage of ripeness and dried in the sun, was a storage technology as old as agriculture in North America. In the garden plots that some enslaved people maintained, corn was sometimes grown, and the surplus, the ears that couldn't be eaten fresh, that came in abundance all at once in late summer, was dried. Dried corn could last through the winter. It could be ground into meal for cornbread. It could be reconstituted in a pot with water and whatever else was available. It was not glamorous. It was the difference between eating in January and not eating in January. The knowledge of which varieties of corn dried best, how long they needed to stay on the cob before harvest, how to test the moisture content, how to store the dried kernels to keep the weevils out. This was agricultural intelligence of a high order. It was the kind of knowledge that had been built up over generations, in Africa, in the Americas, wherever corn growing and food preservation had been practiced by the people doing the work of feeding communities. Number 19. Persimmon pudding. We talked about persimmon beer. But the persimmon had another life in the quarters, a sweeter one. Persimmon pudding, made from ripe, frost-softened persimmons mashed and mixed with cornmeal, and whatever sweetener could be had, often sorghum syrup and baked in the coals, was a seasonal treat, a small sweetness in a life that the larger world had designed to contain none. There is something about the persimmon that demands attention. You cannot rush it. An underripe persimmon will punish you. A ripe persimmon, a persimmon that has been through a frost, that has had its astringency cooked away by cold, is extraordinary. It tastes of honey and brown sugar and something wilder than either of those things. It tastes like a southern autumn, and our ancestors knew this. They knew when the persimmons were ready. They kept track of the first frost the way a gardener keeps track of the last one. They went out in the November cold to gather fruit that nobody else on the plantation thought was worth anything, and they brought it back and they made something sweet. They made something sweet, in a world that had given them so little of it. Number 20. Rabbit and squirrel stew. Hunting for supplemental meat was, on some plantations, permitted. On others, it was done quietly, at night, without permission. Small game, rabbit, squirrel, opossum, the animals of the margins and the thickets, was trapped or hunted by men in the quarters who had that skill, and who used it to bring protein to their families in quantities that the slaveholders' rations did not provide. A rabbit or squirrel stew made with wild greens and field peas and whatever dried herbs were available was not a humble meal in the sense of being inadequate. It was humble in the sense of being built from the land's gifts rather than from the slaveholders' permission. It was, in the most direct sense, free food. Food that existed outside the system of ration and control. Food that could be cooked and eaten without anyone's sanction. Now go ahead and hit that like button, family, if this has meant something to you today. Subscribe if you are not subscribed. We are here every week keeping these memories alive. And drop a comment. Whose hands taught you about food? Who was the cook in your family that nobody outside the family ever knew about? I want to know their name. Tell me about them. Let's give them their flowers right here. Number 21. Sorghum syrup. Sorghum bicolor, is a grain with origins in Africa that was widely grown in the American South, both for grain and for syrup production. On many plantations, sorghum syrup, made by pressing the cane and boiling the juice down to a thick, amber, deeply flavored sweetener, was the only sweetener available to the people in the quarters. White sugar was for the main house. Molasses was sometimes available. Sorghum was what could be had. And sorghum is extraordinary. It has a complexity that refined white sugar lacks entirely, a slight bitterness that makes the sweet more interesting, a depth that reminds you it came from a plant and not a factory, drizzled over cornbread, stirred into a pot of beans, mixed into a dough for a rare sweet cake. Sorghum was the sugar of the quarters, and the people who cooked with it developed a relationship with its particular flavor that persisted long after other sweeteners became available. There are people alive today, older people mostly in rural areas of the South, who still prefer sorghum to any other sweetener, who were raised on it, who find the sweetness of refined sugar too simple, too flat, too without character. They learned that preference from someone, that someone learned it from someone. And at the end of that chain of teaching is a woman in the quarters of a plantation who made the best of what she had, until the best of what she had became the only standard that mattered. Number 22. Okra seed coffee. During the Civil War, when blockades cut off the South's supply of coffee, a substitute was urgently needed. And the substitute that appeared in many black households, including and especially in the households of enslaved and recently freed people, was roasted okra seeds. But here is what the history books don't tell you. Okra seed coffee did not originate with the wartime emergency. It was already known. It had been used long before the blockade, in the quarters, in the years when actual coffee was never going to make its way into a tin cup in a cookhouse. Our ancestors roasted the large round seeds of the okra pod until they were dark and fragrant, then ground them and brewed them like coffee. The result is not identical to coffee. The flavor is nuttier, slightly different, its own thing, but it provided a hot morning drink with a familiar ritual significance. The morning drink. The thing you hold while the day is still dark and the world hasn't yet made its demands on you. Our ancestors insisted on that small dignity. They found a way to have it. And when the war came, and white Southerners suddenly needed to know how to make coffee from okra seeds, the knowledge was there because it had never been lost in the black community to begin with. Number 23. Gumbos are herbs, the Holy Thursday gumbo. This one requires some geography. In Louisiana, among the Creole and enslaved black communities, gumbos are herbs, or green gumbo, was made once a year, on Holy Thursday, the day before Good Friday. It was made from 7 greens, sometimes 9, sometimes 12, always an odd number. And the tradition held that for every green you put in the pot, you would gain a new friend in the coming year. The greens might be mustard and collard and turnip and spinach and watercress and carrot tops and cabbage. Whatever was available and growing. All of it went into the pot, with onion and garlic and file powder, and sometimes a little meat, but sometimes none. Because Holy Thursday is a day of abstinence in the Catholic tradition that shaped Louisiana Creole culture. This is a dish with layers of origin that refuse to be separated neatly. West African green soups, French Catholic ritual, indigenous file powder, the agricultural calendar of the Louisiana plantation, all of it stirred together in one pot that was made by enslaved women and free women of color for their communities on a day that was, in the midst of the worst of what they were living through, holy, set aside, marked. The making of this gumbo was itself a liturgical act, a way of saying, time is ours today, and we know how to use it. Number 24. Red-eye gravy. Ham is expensive. Ham requires a pig big enough to have a proper ham and the curing and smoking of that ham and the waiting. In the quarters, you did not have ham. You had the scraps. You had the drippings. You had the cast-iron skillet with the reddish-brown fond, the caramelized remnants of whatever pork had been cooked in it, clinging to the bottom. And you had strong coffee, which you poured into that hot pan. And what happened when the cold coffee hit the hot iron and the hot fat was a gravy. Red-eye gravy, named for the reddish eye that forms when the coffee and the fat separate slightly in the pan. Thin, savory, slightly bitter from the coffee, carrying all the flavor of whatever had cooked in that skillet before. Poured over grits or biscuits or hominy, red-eye gravy is one of the most efficient uses of almost nothing that exists in American cooking. It is a sauce made from residue, from what is left when the real meal is done. And it is, I want to be honest with you here, one of the most purely good things you can eat on a cold morning. This did not happen by accident. This happened because necessity encountered skill, and skill did what it always does. It made something better than what you'd expect. Number 25. The Secret Garden. I have saved this one for last because this one is not a single food. It is a practice, a habit, a form of resistance so quiet and so persistent that it might be the most radical thing our ancestors ever did. On plantations across the South, in whatever small space they could claim, in the corners of assigned garden plots, in the patches of ground behind the quarters, sometimes in pots, sometimes in hidden clearings in nearby woods, enslaved people grew plants from home, from Africa, from the Caribbean, where many enslaved people had first arrived before being sold further into the interior of the continent. They grew sesame, beni seeds, from West Africa, where sesame was food and medicine and luck. They grew African eggplant, smaller and more bitter than the varieties we know today. They grew sorghum from seed saved across generations. They grew varieties of cowpea that came from Senegal and Sierra Leone and Angola, and that tasted different from the American field pea. Tasted, to those who knew, like somewhere else. They kept seeds hidden. Seeds tucked into the hems of clothing, pressed into the soles of shoes, carried in small cloth bags sewn into garments. Seeds are not weapons. Seeds are not contraband by any obvious measure. And yet seeds were the most subversive thing our ancestors carried because seeds are the future. Because a seed is a decision to come back. Because keeping a seed from West African sesame alive on a South Carolina plantation is an act of saying, I know who I was before this. I know where I came from, and I intend to carry some part of that forward into whatever comes next. These gardens were the original archives, long before anyone thought to write the history down, before the cookbooks and the food historians and the documentary films. There were seeds. There was soil. There were hands that knew how to work both of them in the dark. Family. I have to stop here. Not because there is nothing more to say, there is always more to say, but because I need a moment to let what we have covered today settle down into you the way it has settled into me over the years of thinking about it. 25 foods, 25 practices, 25 pieces of evidence that the people who built this country under conditions of almost incomprehensible violence did not surrender their knowledge, did not surrender their ingenuity, did not surrender their right to feed themselves with dignity and care and the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of human life before they ever set foot on this continent. They cooked in the dark. They grew things in corners where nobody looked. They carried seeds in the hems of their clothing. They turned ash and water and cornmeal into bread. They made wine from wild grapes and coffee from okra seeds and gravy from coffee and pan drippings. They looked at what had been left behind and discarded and thrown at them as an afterthought, and they made a cuisine. A real one. One that is still feeding people today. My granddaddy used to say that you can tell everything about who a people are by what they cook when nobody's watching, by what they make when it costs them something to make it, by what they refuse to stop making even when the world tells them it doesn't matter. I think about that a lot, and I think about the women who stirred those pots in the dark, who passed that stirring to their daughters, who made sure that somebody in the next generation knew, not just how to make the food, but why. Why it mattered. Why we do not forget. That is why I am here. That is why this channel exists. That is why you are still watching. Share this one with somebody in your family who has never heard this history told this way, told from the kitchen, from the ground, from the pot that was boiling before anyone gave permission for it to boil. They need to hear it. Subscribe, because next time, we are going somewhere just as deep and just as real as today. I'll see you next time, family.